good morning, good evening, wherever you are around the world. It's a great privilege to be able to learn together for 18 power minutes. Le'ilui Nishmas, in memory of the soul of our beloved Azriel ben David Eric Samson of blessed memory. I've chosen today a Mishna from the 6th Perek, the 6th chapter of the book of the Ethics of the Fathers, and it is 6:6, the 6th Mishnah of the 6th Perek. And the reason I've chosen this Mishnah is because the Mishnah begins by telling us that Torah is even greater than priesthood or royalty, for royalty is acquired with 30 prerogatives or with 30 privileges, and the priesthood with 24 gifts. But Torah is acquired by means of 48 qualities. And so the Mishnah tells us in a very important principle, and that is that priesthood or royalty, which are positions that a person gains really through inheritance, come with all sorts of values and all sorts of privileges. However, the acquisition of Torah requires not just for a person to be born into a specific family, for a person to have a specific yichus, specific lineage, but rather Torah is accessible to every single human being. Every single human being has the opportunity to access Torah. But the Mishnah continues and tells us that in order to acquire Torah, a person is required to have 48 qualities. And the reason that I chose to speak about this Mishnah now is because we find ourselves, my dear friends, in a very unique time of the Jewish year. We are in what's called Svirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer, the counting of the 50 days between Pesach and Shavuot, where in ancient temple times we would bring a barley offering. And on a deeper level, today, for example, is the 11th day in the counting of the Omer, which is 1 week and 4 days in the counting of the Omer. The rabbis explained to us that unlike Sukkot, who has as its final day an independent holiday called Shmini Atzeret or Simchat Torah, the last day of Pesach is not a holiday in and of itself. It's rather just referred to as Shvi'i Shel Pesach or Achron Shel Pesach, the 7th day of Pesach or the final day of Pesach in the diaspora. But the Talmud refers to Shavuos, which is the holiday upon which we receive the Torah, as Atzeret, which means the conclusion of the gathering together. For you see, my friends, Pesach represents the exodus from Egypt, whereas Shavuos represents the purpose of the exodus from Egypt. Yes, we're all familiar with that old song that became very, very famous in the time of slavery, throughout all of history, of when Israel was in Egypt land. They said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." But that is not the conclusion of the verse. It's Shalach et ami, let my people go, v'yavduni, in order that they may serve me. Rabbi Soloveitchik of blessed memory used to say that when the Jewish people left Egypt, their destination was the land of Israel, but their destiny was Sinai. That which unites every single one of us today on this phone call, and all of the individuals around the world who are learning in memory of the beloved Eric and are joining his family and providing this elevation to his soul. That which unites us is that we and each one of our souls was present at Sinai when we received the Torah. It is the Torah that unites us. It's a Torah which defines the destiny of a Jew. Now, Egypt was a place of absolute immorality. And when the Jewish people left Egypt, on a very deep Kabbalistic level, the rabbis explained to us that in this world there are 50 levels of wisdom. And just like in the world of yin yang, there is always an opposite force. And in God's world, there is a balance. And life is the choice between that balance. So just like there are 50 levels of wisdom, the Kabbalists explained to us there are also 50 levels of impurity. When the Jewish people were in Egypt, they were influenced greatly by the immorality of Egyptian society. And they left and they fell, the rabbis explained to us, all the way to the 49th level of impurity and of immorality. And so, on a much deeper level, the 49 days of counting between Pesach and Shavuot, the 49 days of which we count the Omer, is not just the time of counting, but it's the time, as I like to say it, of making every single day count. Yes, we count the days, but the important is to make every single day count. And we all know, my dear friends, that the uniqueness of the Jewish calendar is that the Jewish calendar is not just a number line that began with the Big Bang and the first peptide bond at the very beginning of creation and continues on straightwards towards infinity. The Jewish concept of time is that time is also a line, but it's not a straight line. It's a circular line, a downward spiral. And each ring on that spiral represents one of the years in the Jewish calendar. And as we return each year on the spiral of that year, so to speak, if a person was holding a slinky and you looked at the downward spiral, every year on that spiral, every rung on that spiral connects with the rung above it. And so when a person comes back to that moment on the rung, which is in the annual cycle of the Jewish calendar, because that rung is positioned directly underneath the rung, beneath it, and beneath the previous one, etc., from the beginning of time. Of course, time as we know it began with the creation of man on Rosh Hashanah, on the first day of creation. And we now are in the year 5782, which means that there are 5,782 years on the slinky of Jewish life. That when a person comes back to that moment in time on the rung of that year, a person who is spiritually sensitive is able to hook into the karma, the unique spiritual energy that exists at that moment of the year. And so the rabbis explained to us that during those first 50 days of counting, after the exodus of Egypt, 49 days, and then on the 50th day we received the Torah, the Jewish people each day were working to extricate themselves from one level of the impurity of Egypt, getting themselves out of the mud, cleaning themselves off, purifying themselves in order to be ready for the grand event of Jewish destiny, which was the receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. The Kabbalists tell us that if you look at this Mishna that we are looking at today, the sixth Mishna of the sixth Perek, when it tells us that Torah is acquired through 48 days, 48 ways. These 48 ways are connected to the first 48 days that we count from Pesach till Shavuot. Now you're asking, Rabbi Shippel, I just told you just told us that they counted 49 days and the 50th day was Shavuot. You're right. And so the mystical writings come and teach us that in fact, the 48 days, the first 48 days are connected, each one to one of these attributes or qualities that are required for the acquisition of Torah. And the 49th day is what's called chazara, or review, the day of reviewing all of these 48 days to make sure that the person's ready and positioned to re-accept the Torah in Mount Sinai on Shavuot. Now, my friends, as we look through this list, and we'll just go through it very, very quickly, because the reality is that one could give a shiur for an hour or many hours on each one of these 48 qualities required for the acquisition of Torah. The general principle that I think we all have to recognize is that in order to teach geometry, a person does not have to be a triangle. A person does not have to be a hypotenuse. In order to teach chemistry, you don't have to be some type of equation. In order to teach physics, you don't have to be some type of centrifugal force. But in order to teach Torah, a person's supposed to live a life of Torah. Because Torah is not about just sharing information. Torah, at its essence, comes from the same Hebrew word, like we say in Hebrew, the Hebrew word for a teacher or a male teacher or a female teacher is a moreh or a morah, because Torah comes from that same Hebrew verb, which means lahorot, to teach. And the purpose of Torah is to help us transform ourselves and our lives and help us at the end of the day to perfect our character. So listen to these 48 qualities. We'll just read through them very quickly. Says the Mishna, but Torah is acquired by means of 48 qualities, which are: number one, study; number two, attentive listening; articulate speech; intuitive understanding; discernment; awe; reverence; modesty; joy; purity; ministering to the sages; closeness with colleagues and one's friends; sharp discussion with students; deliberation; knowledge of Mishna; making sure to have the correct equation of having time for learning Torah, limited business activity, limited intimate activity, limited pleasure, limited sleep, limited conversation, limited laughter, slowness to anger, a good heart, faith in the sages, acceptance of suffering, knowing one's place, being happy with one's lot, making a protective fence around his personal matters, claiming no credit for himself, being beloved, loving the Almighty, loving his creatures, loving righteous ways, loving justice, loving reproof, keeping far from honor, not being arrogant with his learning, not enjoying halachic decision-making, sharing fellows' yoke, judging him favorably, setting him on the truthful course, set him on the peaceful course, thinking deliberately in his study, asking and answering, listening and contributing to the discussion, learning in order to teach, learning in order to practice, making his teacher wiser, pondering over what he has learned. And now listen to the final of the 48 ways. Because there's a psychological technique, and that is modern psychologists teach us. When a child goes to speak to the parent, and they say, "Mommy, Daddy, listen, we have 3 or 4 things we'd like to discuss with you." Every parent learns very quickly that the first 3 are just fillers. The 4th one, the final one, is really what they want to discuss. The rabbis teach us similarly that when you have a list, yes, everything in the list is important, but hakol holech achar hagmar, everything goes according to the finish. At the end of the day, the final matter on the list is that which encapsulates it all. And listen to the 48th way. And of course, we all know, my friends, that 48 in Hebrew are the 2 letters mem chet, which means moach, which means brain or intellect. That if a person wants to acquire Torah and to truly transform themselves This is what Torah is supposed to lead us towards. And listen what it says. The final one. I'll read it in Hebrew and then in English, and we'll learn a lesson for life. Says the author of the Mishnah, V'ha'omer davar b'shem omro, and the one who is careful, who, when he repeats a matter of learning, repeats the matter of learning in the name of the one who said it. Halamadata, for behold, we have learned. Kol ha'omer davar b'shem omro, whoever repeats a matter of Torah learning in the name of one who said it, Mevi ge'ula le'olam, brings redemption to the world. Shneimar, as it says in the verse in the book of Esther, in the scroll of Esther that we just read some 5 weeks ago on Purim, V'tomar Esther lamelech b'shem Mordechai, and Esther said to the king in the name of Mordechai. Now, what does this 48th way mean? Well, on the most simple level, the 48th way comes to tell us that a person may have engaged in the learning of Torah, and a person may have acquired all of these incredible 48 qualities, which means these are issues and matters and mannerisms and patterns of actions that a person has to work on in order to truly acquire Torah. But at the end of the day, the 48th way says someone who's acquired Torah is a person who repeats a saying in the name of the one who said it, which means you give credit where credit is due. When you share a word of great wisdom, or when you share an insight, quote the source correctly where it comes from. What does that mean on a most simple level? It means that the individual who's acquired Torah is a person of great humility, a person who doesn't take credit for something that is not their own, but rather always looks to quote the proper source of where it comes from. And here the Mishnah concludes in telling us, for behold, we have learned that whoever quotes something properly in the name of the one who originally said it brings redemption to the world. For the verse says in the second chapter of the book of Esther, of Megillat Esther, and Esther said to the king in the name of Mordechai. Now, what's this verse referring to? Well, if you think back to the Purim story, we'll all remember that in the second chapter of the Purim story, Mordechai is one of the last members of the Sanhedrin, the great court of the Jewish people, the uncle or husband of Esther, is sitting outside the palace gates. And he overhears two palace guards named Bigtan and Teresh, and they speak a language called Tarshishi, which is Tajian, and he hears that they are planning a coup to take over the kingdom and to unseat Achashverosh, the king. And Mordechai goes and he tells about their plot to Esther, and Esther relates the story to Achashverosh. And Bigsan and Teresh are taken care of. Now, what does it mean that this brings redemption to the world? Well, if you think later in the Purim story, one of the most poignant moments in the entire Purim story is that night when we read in the Megillah, and all of a sudden one night Achashverosh couldn't sleep. And he says, bring out the royal record books. And they bring out the royal record books, and they just happen to open to a page. And on that page is written the story when Esther related to Mordechai about the plans of an attempted coup of Bigsan and Teresh. And Esther had told the story of this attempted coup to Achashverosh in the name of Mordechai. And so as a result, his name was recorded as being the source of the information in the royal record book. And as a result, we all know that just so happens that Haman happened to be walking by. And Achashverosh says, who's that whose footsteps I hear? And it's no one other than the wicked Haman. And Achashverosh says to him, what should I do to the one whom the king wishes to honor? And Haman, of course, being the arrogant individual he was, assumed that Achashverosh was speaking about himself. And he said, what do you mean? He says, the one who the king wants to honor, dress him in the royal garb, put him on the royal horse, and let Mordechai, the Jew, prancing through the town, lead him through the town on the royal horse and say, look, this is what's done to the individual that the king wishes to honor. And what happens? Because it was said in the name of Mordechai by Esther, and she didn't take credit herself, Achashverosh then tells Haman to take Mordechai, dress him in the royal clothing, put him on the royal horse. And Haman has to very humbly now walk Mordechai through the streets of Shushan, the capital of the Persian Empire. And that's when the story changes. For redemption comes when a person quotes properly the source where the learning has come from. And the rabbis teach us, my friends, on an even deeper level, two things. And perhaps that will end. I know when Stephen and Frankie say 18 minutes is really 18 minutes. And I just want you to know that on one hand, this is the 48th way, which is telling us that a person could learn all the Torah in the world. But if at the end of the day, Torah does not transform your character, it doesn't teach you how to become a better person, how to be a humble individual who only takes credit where credit's due and has pride in sharing the source for that which they've learned by quoting the source properly, then something hasn't worked with the Torah. Torah is not meant to make a person, God forbid, arrogant. Torah is not meant to make a person judgmental. Torah is there to transform us, to become truly humble people. And if it has the impact on us that it's meant to have, not only do we bring redemption to the world, but we bring redemption to ourselves. Because every human being is here for a specific purpose. You know, many students have asked me over the years, why is it so important to quote Torah properly in terms of the source where it comes from? At the end of the day, all of Torah was given to us from God to Moses, Mount Sinai. So just quote God. And the answer is, my friends, yes. Torah was given to us from God to Moses, Mount Sinai. But it wasn't all revealed at once. And as I look around, the names on this phone, whether you're Vicky or Daniel or Amir or Malka, or Kim or Leah or Alan or Tom or Terry or Bianca, or our beloved Sheila, she should live and be well and have nachas till 120 from all of her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I want you to know that every single one of us is here to reveal a new aspect of Torah to this world. And yes, it is God's Torah. But when I had the privilege, so to speak, to learn with Sheila, and Sheila gives us some type of insight into the Mishna of her own, then that is Sheila revealing part of God's Torah to this world. So when we quote the source properly, Not only is it the ultimate expression of humility, my friends, not only does it bring redemption to the world, because at the end of the day, humility, and when we look around the world today, we all see what hubris or arrogance is accomplishing. You know, my father-in-law, blessed memory, always used to say, I don't know where the source was, but I'll quote him as he would say it. He was a Holocaust survivor. He used to say in the English language, the word unite and the word untie have the exact same letters. The question is where you put the I. If the I is in the middle, then it's unite. If the I is biased and it's off to one side, then it's untie. Yes, when we are humble and able to quote the source of that which we've learned, we don't just bring redemption to the world, we bring redemption to ourselves, because the world learns that which means to be living a life committed to Torah means a life of humility. But in quoting the source, we also recognize that every single one of us, my friends, is here in this world because it's a part of God's Torah and God's wisdom that he's waiting for us to reveal and bring out to this world. My friends, I'll end with one short idea, 20 seconds. And that is in the secular disciplines, which the Torah refers to Chachma, and there's great wisdom to learn in every discipline that exists out there. But Torah, which is transformational, is different than any type of secular discipline, because the purpose of it is to transform you. And therefore, my friends, the title that we give to a great Torah scholar, whether it's a man or a woman, whether it's young or old, is not that they've become an expert, and not that they've become a professor, and not that they've become a Nobel laureate, but rather they're known as a Talmid Chacham or a Talmidah Chachama. Chacham means wise. Chachama means wise. Talmid means you're a student who's wise. Because the greatest scholar of our people, the greatest scholar of Torah, whether male or female, is still a student. He's a Talmid Chacham, a student who's wise, a Talmidah Chachama, a female student who's wise. Because the goal in Judaism is to be a perpetual student. Just like the 48 ways have taught us. The learning from one's students, or the continuous desire to learn, is that which has defined us as true scholars. I want to give us all a blessing as we find ourselves in this period of these 49 days of counting. That not only do we count the days, but we make the days count. And let's perhaps connect them with one of the ways of this Mishna in Pirkei Avot. So when it comes to Shavuos on the 50th day, each one of us can really hook into that energy of the reacceptance of the Torah, because we have used these days to count, days to transform ourselves, days to introspect and understand that the purpose of Torah at the end of the day is to help us build a relationship with God through the perfection of our character. Le'ilu nishmas Azriel ben David, may the learning that we've done together today bring an ultimate elevation to the soul of Eric Samson, Zechron Livracha, Azriel ben David. And we ask Eric in Himmel, in the heavenly spheres, to be a good to better, to be the good intermediary on behalf of his wife and his children and grandchildren, sons-in-law, daughters-in-law, great-grandchildren, on behalf of all of us, should ask the Almighty that, please God, true redemption and true peace should be restored to all of mankind. Shalom from Manhattan. It's been a great privilege to learn with each one of you.